that's available to you. And so I want to encourage you as you're preparing for exams and as you're preparing for even quizzes, it is a resource that's available to go back and listen to our class. You'll probably have already noticed this, but the exam, it doesn't just pull from slide material. I also pull from our discussion materials. And so it's really important that you are engaged and checked in when we are having our discussion, because oftentimes our exam questions are going to come out of those. Those discussion questions really give us an opportunity to sit and integrate a lot of the pieces of information from the material. So, any questions about any of that? Nobody got a perfect score, although some people got close. And yeah, the range was pretty wide, which is fairly normal. It is just the first exam. It's not a huge deal. If you scored somewhere on it that you are not happy with, sometime between now and the second exam, you and I need to sit down. We need to have a conversation. Some of you have already reached out to me, and that's something I want to do. Okay, sit down and we can talk through how to prepare for exams and quizzes differently. All right? No questions? Okay, let me pray for us. Father, I've been reminded this weekend of just the incredible opportunity it is to serve alongside you as you redeem all of your creation. Father, as you redeem all of mankind, as you redeem everything that you've made, and I know that your word teaches us that part of that redemptive process is going to be a cleansing. And Father, I pray that as we participate with you in what you're doing, as you're calling people to yourself, Father, remind us that we have an incredible privilege, but also an incredible responsibility to share the good news, to communicate with people that we've been offered something just incredible, and that is to do exactly what you've designed us to do, to have a relationship with you. Father, as we read through your word and we see that you've designed us for that purpose, I pray that it would encourage us to know that we are experiencing that. And it would encourage us to know that we can share that news with others and that they can experience that and begin to build that relationship with you even on this side of eternity. Pray that that would be true and that we would be great instruments in your hands. We ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, so we need to talk about seed plants now. Yeah, a lot of what we're going to talk in here are how does the structure of seed plants, how do some of the features that they have enable them to be so incredibly diverse, and what does that actually mean? How do we reason through this? How do we think about seed plants from various perspectives on the origins of life? So here are our framing questions. I told you last week what my goal was, and then I didn't meet it, and I know that was super discouraging for you. So I'm not even going to tell you what my goal is for how many of these framing questions we get through today. And so we have 6. I think we usually have 6. Occasionally there's another one that slips in. But yeah, these first couple of questions, we're talking about the diversity of in the first question of specifically angiosperms, but in the second question of seed plants as a whole, and talking about how does the diversity of these forms relate to some of their features, behavioral features or structural features. The third question is kind of interesting. So how would you distinguish between a cycad and a palm tree? In this, we'll talk a little bit about gymnosperms, which are one of our groups of seed plants, and how a group of that, the cycads, actually look a lot like an angiosperm, a fruit-bearing plant. Why are angiosperms the dominant plants in most ecosystems? Why is using animal pollination advantageous? And then finally, how do we measure biodiversity and why is it important? And this, we're going to focus on biodiversity in plants, because that's what we're talking about this week, right? And I realized I did something really sad in that I told you we skipped chapter 24, we'll come back to it, but then when I put the slides on Canvas, I put the slides for chapter 25 under chapter 24, like it's titled chapter 24, and that was horrible of me, and I just realized that this morning I didn't have time to fix it. I will fix that. You deserve better. and I apologize. It's confusing, and it's just not right. I will fix that. I will fix that problem. All right. All this to say, let's hit the first framing question. All right, so what is the relationship between angiosperm diversity and insect diversity? Let's talk about that. First thing you know, looking at the fossil record, both insects and angiosperms see a spike in their diversity during the Triassic period. And you know exactly what I'm talking about with the Triassic, even though I didn't write it up there, because you have that framework of Paleozoic, Mesozoic, Cenozoic. We'll come back to that. I pulled a diagram out of the text this time, so I don't have to draw it up on the board. Maybe it's better organized than mine. I don't know. But you see a spike in the fossil record basically at the same time. At the same time you see a spike in the number of angiosperms showing up, you see a spike in the number of insects showing up. Kind of interesting. Makes you think that there's some kind of a relationship between insect diversity and angiosperms. Now, living forms, angiosperms are by far the most diverse of all of the plants. By far. Angiosperms by far the most diverse of all the plants. Insects, by far the most diverse of all the animals. Now we've got another interesting thing going on, right? Showing or suggesting that there's some kind of a relationship between insect diversity and angiosperm diversity. Let's explain this. One explanation, regardless of your view of origins, is this idea of coevolution. So coevolution, especially in terms of generating new forms, which generating new forms in terms of, let's say generating new species, not forms. Forms is confusing. But generating new species is still a mechanism of microevolution. And I know we haven't talked about the dynamics of how evolution works. We'll do that at the end of our semester together. You'll love it. Okay? Actually, I can't promise that. In fact, I can almost promise that you will not love it. But you will appreciate it at some point in your life. Maybe not while we're doing it, but at some point in your life you will appreciate it. But generating new species is fairly easy to explain regardless of your view of origins, okay? You could get into a discussion of how do we even define a species, is there any value to defining species? Different discussion altogether, but generating new species is certainly not a difficult thing to do, okay? And so coevolution, even if you are generating new species, this occurs when two different groups are either in an arms race against each other, like one of them eats the other, right? And so the individuals that are being eaten, the best individuals are those that get eaten the least, right? Kind of makes sense. Let's think about it this way. You are a mouse, right? You live amongst a lot of other mice, right? If you are going to leave more that's offspring. There we go. More dependents. That's a terrible thing. It's not even tax time yet. If you are going to leave more offspring than the other mice around you, you need to survive predation better than they do, right? And so the mice that are going to survive best are those that are fastest, those that blend in best with their environment, those that are the most savvy, right? Stay hidden, okay? Balance risk-prone and risk-averse behaviors well. Same is true of plants. And you're like, well, plants aren't really very fast, right? Although they do sometimes blend in with their environment. But the plants that are going to survive best are those that are best at avoiding being eaten, right? And then the animals that eat the plants the best are going to make the most offspring. So there's kind of this arms race, right? Which over time the plants should get better able to fight off things that eat them. But the things that eat them should get better able at actually eating the plants. And so you have kind of this crazy situation going on. So that's one way in which we can get coevolution. We can even start to develop new species. We'll talk about how that works in a few weeks. Coevolution can also happen when two different forms rely on each other for survival. And so that is if one form cannot survive and reproduce without the other form, they again kind of get into this coevolutionary relationship that can produce new species. And again, if you don't believe that, hopefully at some point during the semester you will, and I will show you how that works and show you that it's not as complex as you might think. All right. So now let's talk about the specific relationship between angiosperms and insects. Okay, angiosperms rely on insects for pollination. So angiosperms, pollination is the process of basically fertilizing female gametes with male gametes. Okay, pollination relies on insects for many angiosperms. Not all angiosperms, but many angiosperm species rely on insects for pollination. So they can't reproduce without insects. And you're like, okay, well now the survival of both is dependent upon the other, right? The insects depend on the plant for food. The plant depends on the insects for reproduction. And so you've got everything you need in place to have this coevolution going, where you could even develop new species of your plant and new species of the insect. Okay? And then also, angiosperms have to try to avoid being eaten by other insects. And so you've got your other type of coevolution going, where you've got this arms race. And so you have both phenomena at play with angiosperms and insects, trying to demonstrate to you why there's a relationship between angiosperm diversity and insect diversity. Now, then we have a question, is that enough to explain the diversity as a whole, right? So noting a relationship between the diversity of one and the diversity of other is a completely different thing than saying one caused the other. Yes? Okay, we'll get to that. We're going to have our lecture break. You're going to spend some time talking about that. We'll spend some time together talking about that. Does a relationship dictate a cause and effect relationship, right? Is that the only way to explain that two things increase at the same time or increase together? Some of the diversity of seed plants, all of these are actually angiosperms. That's sad. Would have been nice to actually throw in some gymnosperms there in this picture on the diversity of seed plants. Yeah, these are all angiosperms. What are you going to do, right? Came right out of the textbook. I got rid of some of the figures when I put these slides together because I didn't like them. This one I thought I really liked, and now that I look at it, I don't like it as much as I thought I did because you should have thrown in a pine tree or two. It's disappointing. Okay, so here is our geologic time scale. Here are our eras. I gave you 4: Cenozoic, Mesozoic, Paleozoic, and then said just think of all of this as before the Paleozoic, the Precambrian. This separates it into 2 different eras. It's fine. We're not going to deal with that. Okay? So Paleozoic, we talked about this, right? Silurian, Devonian, we talked about those in context of seedless plants, right? Seedless plants start to show up in certain periods inside of here. Okay, so the Triassic. An interesting thing happens during the Triassic. Actually, you get a lot of really interesting things happen during the Triassic. A lot of dinosaurs show up. And who doesn't love dinosaurs, right? A lot of dinosaurs show up in the fossil record there during the Triassic period. Less interesting, but still true, is your angiosperm diversity really spikes here, and your insect diversity really spikes here in this Triassic period. So again, there seems to be some kind of a relationship between the diversity of angiosperms and the diversity of insects. We talked about that. Angiosperms rely on insects to pollinate, right? To reproduce. They also have an arms race with insects that have to protect themselves from others that use them as a food source. Okay. Regardless of what your view of origins is, and we've mentioned this before, these periods are helpful. So you may look at it as different things. You may look at it as some kind of a deposit made during a global flood. We'll get there and we'll talk about this. Or you may look at it as an actual progression through geologic time. It's long periods of time. Yeah?
So in all those different periods, each thing happened, just not like from our point of view, it happened in that amount of time? Or it just
Well,
happened in
so
order?
the question is, are you looking at a snapshot, right? Or are you looking at it like a series of images, right? And so if what this is actually a snapshot, then a way you could explain this is you're looking at a specific environment type, that is laid down in a particular order during a global flood. And so that's the way that this is oftentimes interpreted with the idea of having a global flood. Most thinkers would think that the global flood started here and it ended somewhere around here. Okay, and so what you're looking at is kind of a move through different types of ecosystems that are laid down at different periods during a global flood. But we'll get there, and we'll talk about this when we talk about macroevolution. We'll talk about how do you think through the fossil record. Just suffice it to say now, during the Triassic, you have a lot of angiosperms and you have a lot of insects, okay? There's some kind of a relationship there, and we'll get there. So here's our phylogeny of plants, all plants. Actually, not just plants, also green algae, although some would argue that green algae are also plants. And so I know you love phylogenies, and I was going to take this and just extend out Archaeplastida for you, but then that gets really complex. So just note that this basically represents all of Archaeplastida, one of our 6 supergroups of eukaryotes, right? You have excavata, you have chrome alveolata, you have Archaeplastida, you've got Rhizaria, Amoebozoa, Opisthoconta, right? Our 6 supergroups. So this represents one of those 6 supergroups, Archaeplastida, and here it is expanded out to show you your different plant groups. Here are your mosses, liverworts, hornworts, our bryophytes. Here are our seedless vascular plants, all right here. And then here are our seed plants. So seedless vascular seed plants. It's a good diagram. Not because it's something you need to know all these different taxa, but I think it's a good diagram for illustrating what we're talking about. Okay? And so if you look at seed plants, what is this diagram actually telling you about seed plants? Any thoughts? So as you look on this diagram, what is actually telling us about seed plants?
They're very derived.
Yeah, I mean, look at this. So if you're going to go back to the original, let's just restrict it to plants, right? So if you're going to go back to the original plant, compared to these groups, which there aren't a lot of ancestors to kind of interfere, get in the way as you back up to this original plant, look at all these ancestors. Boom, 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 boom. Finally, you get back to that ancestor of all of your plants. And so there are a lot of intermediate forms there. So this diagram is telling you that seed plants are your most derived or your most complex forms of plants. Okay, think about that. Because again, we're going to have a discussion about that very idea. Can we explain seed plants as being the evolutionary derivative of seedless plants? Okay. Alrighty. Notice what you don't see here. That we saw the last time I showed you a phylogeny of eukaryotes.
Polytomy.
A polytomy, right? There's no polytomy here. And then so you're thinking, well, does that actually mean that we have something that makes some sense? There's a polytomy here. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah, there's a polytomy here with your green algae. But once you get into plants, you don't have a polytomy. Well, does that mean that it actually illustrates that well? We'll talk about that. All right, next framing question. How do seeds and pollen allow seed plants to populate diverse ecosystems? Man, that is a really good framing question. Really good. I'd like to take full credit for it, but I actually modified this one from one of the questions that's in the text. So, I can't take full credit for it. This is a really good question. So, as you think through this, you need to remember some things about seedless plants. Remember that seedless plants require their sperm to travel through water to get from the antheridium, where they are produced, to the archegonium by swimming. The archegonium, the female gametophyte, antheridium, the male gametophyte. And so the sperm are flagellated to make this possible, moved by flagella, swimming through the water to get from the antheridium to the archegonium. Okay, so you need to remember, seedless plants, their fertilization requires water. Another thing you need to remember. Remember that the zygote, that is the cell that's formed by the fusion of a male gamete with a female gamete, the sperm with the ovum. Remember that the zygote actually develops inside of the gametophyte. It's protected in your seedless plants. Okay, so the fertilization requires water. The gametophyte doesn't spread or the zygote doesn't develop apart from the gametophyte. So both these features make seedless plants, especially the non-vascular seedless plants like mosses, liverworts, hornworts, tied to moist environments. Okay, their fertilization or their reproduction can only happen during moist times. And so this is something that limits the distribution of seedless plants, especially non-vascular seedless plants, right? They can only live in really moist environments, or at least environments that are moist for a good chunk of the year so they can reproduce. Make sense? Okay. Pollen grains, something that you have in seed plants that you do not have in seedless plants. Pollen grains are the male gametophytes. They're carried by the wind or carried by water or carried by animals. You get a variety of ways you can carry that. And they're protected from desiccation. And so the gametophyte is actually traveling. You didn't have the gametophyte traveling in your seedless plants, right? Even in ferns, where the dominant life stage is which? Gametophyte or sporophyte? So in your seedless, non-vascular, dominant stage is the gametophyte. In your seedless, vascular, like the ferns, dominant stage is the sporophyte. Okay? But even in that, the gametophyte doesn't travel, right? It grows on the soil, and then the sporophyte just grows out of it and completely obliterates the gametophyte. Okay? But now, in seed plants, your male gametophyte is on the move. It's traveling. The entire gametophyte, not just the gametes, the entire gametophyte is on the move, keeping the gametes moist, okay, protecting them from desiccation, and actually physically moving them around. So the gametes aren't released. They don't have to swim through water. They don't have to worry about drying out because the male gametophyte is on the move, moving around as pollen. Seeds. So seeds contain the developing sporophyte, which is also the dominant life stage of all of our seed plants. Seeds have multiple layers that also resist drying out. So now you got your male gametophyte, it's on the move, taking the male gametes, the sperm, where they need to go, keeping them from drying out. And your seed, containing the developing sporophyte, also keeps that sporophyte from drying out. So now it doesn't matter where you're at. It doesn't matter if your environment's dry. It doesn't matter if it's moist. You don't need water to reproduce. You don't need to worry about losing water because you have these structures that keep whatever water's present inside of those structures as the embryo develops or as the gametes are stored. Now you got something nice. So how do seeds and pollen allow seed plants to populate diverse ecosystems? What's that? Yeah, they protect it from water loss. So it doesn't matter. You can grow and develop in a really dry ecosystem because you have ways of storing whatever water is present. It's nice, right? I know you're just amazed, right? You just can't even imagine what you're going to do with this new information, right? You're going to go running around campus telling everybody you can find, you're going to write mom and dad, right? Shoot out text messages to all of your friends.
If we do that, will we get extra credit?
No. No, but I will encourage you and maybe give you a high five. I'm a little bit weird with, touching people, but maybe, I'm just kidding, I don't. Somebody left this coffee cup, right, last time? You said it was for my birthday, didn't you?
Yeah.
And it's still here. I'm going to take it. You know, I gave the person time to come and find it. So, and it says faculty. Look at that. Maybe it is mine. Okay, lecture break. So what I want you to do is this. You can immediately start talking with those around you because this is a big question. It's a heavy question. So how can we explain the seed plants evolving from seedless plants, and are there any evidences of this? So how do we actually explain seed plants evolving from seedless plants, and are there evidences of this? Think about the phylogeny I showed you that lacks a polytomy, right? Think about that. I don't want to give you too much information, but think through this. Take a couple of minutes, start this discussion with those around you, and then we'll finish this together. What say you? What do you say? What do you have?
I'm sorry, I don't know my urban lingo. I should.
That is not urban. That is like colonial.
That's kind of urban. They had towns. I say. First question is. I've never looked into plant evolution before. I would actually ask. Okay, so you mentioned polytomies are inexplicable. Is it actually relevant? Is it, can you say that it's possible that seed plants made from seedless plants? Is it possible for us to say that it's our form of
Stephanie?
because there is a
Did you do Steph or Stephanie? Stephanie, not Steph. We don't like Steph. I mean, it's one syllable instead of three. There's some value to that, right? I'll do Stephanie. I accept that. You're Kara, not Kara. Rachel. And is Kaylin or Kylan? Kaylin. Hobart? Hobart. All right. What do we got? What do we got? How do we explain this, and are there evidences of this? Anna.
Well, we kind of just talked about how a seedless plant could have been in an environment where it needed to learn to protect, and so, had to adapt and protect the water and store the water.
Right, so what you would probably want to see is you'd want some kind of environment that is wet at some times of the year and dry at others. The nice thing is you've got tropical rainforests that are wet all the time, right? I mean, it rains all year long. The temperature really never gets above like 90 degrees, never gets below 80 degrees, right? Just very stable. But then you have tropical dry forests. Another story altogether. Periods of really heavy rainfall, periods of really dry conditions. And so you do have some environments where you'd like to see some of that pressure, right? So some individuals are going to be better at surviving those dry periods than others, yes? And so those individuals are probably going to have better mechanisms to store their water. And over time, could you develop some structures? Maybe, okay? Yeah, so I mean, that would be a great way of explaining it, right? You'd want to start off in an environment that's not always dry, right? You don't start off with an environment like ours, where like we've got our wet season, which it's like, woo, you get 8 inches of rain. Like that's super duper wet. It's not wet at all. It's a joke, okay? We have 2 seasons, hot and hotter, right? Or let's say dry and drier. Let's go with that, because it's not always hot in the winter, I get it, but dry and drier. Right? So don't start off with an environment like this, but start off with one that's got a wet season and has a dry season. Good. Yeah. Other ways how we might explain seed plants developing. There's obviously a need for it, right? There are dry environments. If plants cannot make use of that, any plant that could is going to have a really big advantage, right? If you can take advantage of a dry environment, you could produce offspring in places where there aren't things trying to eat you because all the plants that they're eating are somewhere else, and there aren't other plants competing with you for sunlight, and you're like, how do you compete for sunlight? That's ridiculous. Sunlight's unlimited. Yeah, unless one plant is bigger than you are, and it soaks up all the sunlight, and you get none of it, right? It's like try to compete with a tree for sunlight if you want to sunbathe and tan. You will lose, right? Every time. Every time. That's how you compete for sunlight, right? So there's obviously an advantage to being able to use an environment that other plants aren't, right? And that's how you'd get this shift over to seed plants. But we got to deal with some stuff, right? How do you develop these structures? Yeah.
Okay, so obviously since some of the pollen stuff is carried by animals, you need animals to help aid this process. So you have a group of plants, and they all get eaten up by animals, and the ones that had the resistant structures so they could survive animal digestion and stuff, those are the ones that continue to reproduce.
This is really interesting. So only what are believed to be the most derived of the seed plants actually use animals.
Okay. But
Although, yeah, so our gymnosperms, and we'll talk more about this as we continue to move through our slides for this week, but the gymnosperms, they produce naked seeds, mostly produce cones, but a lot of their fertilization happens by the wind dispersed pollen.
Okay.
And so they're believed to be the more primitive of the seed plants.
Okay.
And the angiosperms that produce coated seeds, they don't produce naked seeds, they produce coated seeds, and they have a more wide variety of pollination schemes. And so it's interesting as you kind of get, you have some group of plants that actually look more primitive, and they still rely on wind and sometimes water. And then as you're getting better seeds, then you start to open up your different pollination schemes. Kind of got some interesting stuff going on. Yeah.
So if I can just step back and ask a more broader question, can we fit plant evolution in a creation framework to begin with, as in this big of a change?
No. I guess it depends on how much time we're dealing with, right? So there's really there's two big ideas in which you would call creation ideas. There's old Earth and there's young Earth. If you're still dealing with hundreds of millions of years, sure. But then you have some other questions you have to deal with altogether. But if you're dealing with what the Bible says about origins is actually true, you don't have that amount of time, and no, you couldn't generate this amount of change. There's just too much. Yeah, there's just too much. Right now we're not dealing with evidences against. We'll talk about that as we continue on. We'll talk about that on Friday. We'll spend a lot of time talking about this. Right now we're only talking about evidences for. Nobody's mentioned the phylogeny yet. There's no polytomy in that phylogeny. It's actually a pretty clean phylogeny on the surface, right? You get in there and you realize that there's kind of a mess and you get a whole bunch of different phylogenies. But on the surface, it looks pretty neat, pretty clean. Like something you would expect if those ancestors did actually exist. It's kind of interesting. And if you actually read the first section of chapter 26, and it talks about seed plant evolution, you realize that your group that's believed to be most primitive, that is the most like seedless plants, actually appear first in the fossil record than the more derived groups do. And so now you've got, a real big need, right? Lots of dry environments for plants to fill, right? So any plants that could develop some way of exploiting those ecosystems would have a real advantage, right? You've got a need. You've got a phylogeny that looks pretty good, pretty clean. You've got a fossil record that also lends some support. Seed plants appear after seedless plants. Okay? So seed plants appear in the fossil record after seedless plants, and your more primitive seed plants appear before the more derived seed plants. And so you have a fossil record and a phylogeny and just a scenario that makes sense and seems to provide some good support for that. And then even if you get into these new structures, so pollen grains, it's just a mobile male gametophyte. It's not like you're really developing any real new structure. The male gametophyte is on the move. It's not attached, it's not rooted, it's on the move. You're not really developing a whole new structure until you get here. Okay? The seeds, this is a novel structure, and especially as we get into angiosperms. So then you have to come up with some way by which you might develop that. But the pollen's not really a new structure. It's just a traveling male gametophyte. And it's not really like, I don't want you to think of like this traveling male gametophyte like it's hopping in a little buggy and cruising around. Like the wind's just blowing it around, or maybe floating in water, similar to what you would find in the sperm from your seedless plants. Okay? So it's not like, getting in a boat and motoring itself around. It's not a real complex type of movement. Yeah.
So, when are the first seeded plants actually found?
The Devonian.
The Devonian.
Yep. And so you've got Carboniferous, or you've got Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian. Okay, so it's the fourth period in the Paleozoic era, and your first fossils of seedless plants appear in the Silurian. Now, the idea is they would have had to originate in the Ordovician, although there's no fossil record of that, but there are fossil forms in the Silurian before the Devonian. Yeah?
So is it consistent that the more derived plants are always found in the harsher environments, or like
No.
desert, do we see less derived plants where we think we would need more derived plants?
No, I see what you're getting.
Seeds tend to be more derived. Are they designed for those?
Yeah, when you get into like living forms, it's a little bit difficult to say which species are more derived, right? So you can say angiosperms, which are fruit-bearing plants, are more derived than gymnosperms, non-fruit-bearing seed plants. But it's hard to like say from a specific, like say a cactus versus, I don't know, an avocado tree, right? Yeah. Cacti grow in very dry, very arid environments. Avocado trees kind of live in more variable, kind of a typical temperate environment. It gets dry at times, but it's fairly moist. It's hard to say which of those two is more derived, right? It's just that they're both really well adapted for where they're living. It's hard to say which of those two is more derived. So it would be a hard question to answer. Although in your most extreme environments, you could say only the most derived forms could actually exist in there. Yeah. And that, you don't find seedless plants really in really dry places. You find very few gymnosperms, the less derived of your seed plants, in really dry environments.
Okay.
Yeah. So here are different pollen grains, and again, keep in mind this is the male gametophyte. And so a lot of times what we're talking about when we say a fossilized remain of a plant, a lot of times we're just dealing with the pollen. That's really what we find in the fossil record. All right, so here's the life cycle of a conifer, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a couple of slides. But a conifer is the most diverse group of our gymnosperms. Okay, and again, we'll talk more about these terms. But it's the most diverse group of our gymnosperms. And in many of our conifers, I don't want to say most, it's most, but I don't want to say all. But in most of our conifers, both male and female gametophytes are produced on the individual. So the individual is both male and female, producing male and female gametophytes. The female gametophytes are located in cones higher up in the tree. The male gametophytes are located in cones lower down. And so as the wind blows, it can pick up, what tends to happen is it picks up those male gametophytes, those pollen grains, and actually can carry them up to the cones that have the female gametophytes higher up and allow for that fertilization to happen. So a lot of your conifers will self-fertilize, which is cool if your goal is just produce as many offspring as possible. Not so cool if you live in a highly variable environment. Okay? Keep that in mind. And so here is your pollen grain, your male gametophyte. Here's a tube that it forms when it recognizes that it's near a female gametophyte. And this pollen tube carries the sperm over into the ovum, into the female gamete. And then once that happens, fertilization ensues and your seed starts to develop. Okay, and then your seeds develop, and a lot of times the entire female gametophyte will fall down from the tree. It has kind of like that blade-like wispy structure. That's not just for gymnosperms. A lot of angiosperms do that as well. Yeah.
Does it affect it when like different speeds of wind?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Like, not to happen as much?
Yeah. Well, and higher wind speeds can actually help to eliminate self-fertilization and promote cross-fertilization, taking the male gametophytes to other trees. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
Okay, it's kind of on topic.
I love questions that are off topic.
It's on topic. So you have like a weed that has a plant life of maybe like a couple months.
Right.
Good weed. And then you have like a pine tree that hundreds. Of
Oh,
years
yeah.
old.
General Sherman. I mean, yeah. There's a tree called Methuselah that's like just super duper old.
Yeah. How do you explain like what determines like the age of an organism? Because the lifespan of organisms is just so all over the place.
Yeah. That's a good question. The thing that correlates most is metabolic rate. How active are they? The more active an organism is, that is the more chemical reactions that are taking place, and the more rapidly those chemical reactions are happening, the less time an organism lives. And that tends to be the thing that correlates best with the age of an organism. So for instance, like if you look at a sea turtle's metabolic rate, I mean, it's just a fraction of ours, right? I mean, they're like, sometimes their metabolic rate is so low that you're like, are they even alive, right? But they don't mind. I mean, they're going to live for 250 years. Like, they couldn't care less about speeding up their metabolic rate. And then you've got like a mouse that's metabolic rate is just, I mean, it's just crazy. Yeah, and then it doesn't last very long. I got to tell you this. So I got your questions and we'll address those, but I need to tell you this. So the smaller a mammal is, the faster its metabolic rate.
Okay.
Kind of makes sense, and tends to be the shorter its lifespan. So if you were to take a mouse, like just your standard mouse, and you slowed its metabolic rate down to what ours is, it would generate just a really small amount of heat, okay? Instead of generating a huge amount of heat. But a mouse has a lot of surface area compared to its volume. The bigger you get, the less surface area you have compared to your volume, okay? We'll talk a lot about that in cell, but just believe it to be true now, okay? The bigger you are, the less surface area you have relative to your volume, meaning the bigger you are, the harder it is to lose heat, okay, the heat that you're generating. So a mouse, really small, a lot of surface area, loses a lot of heat. So it's got to generate a lot of heat. If you were to take a mouse, slow its metabolic rate to that of ours, its fur would need to be 6 inches thick to keep it warm enough that it wouldn't freeze to death. But it would live a lot longer. So it'd be like, I don't even know what it would look like a basketball, but a furry basketball. Just like a ball of fur, and it would live a lot longer. But man, it would be hard to eat, like just living that kind of existence. Yeah, Jacob, and then we'll go up to Sydney.
So to have like a metabolism that low for such a small mammal or even a reptile when they go into their brumation states and when mammals go into their hibernation states, would they sort of be in between a state of like fully awake and then that hibernation or brumation state?
Yeah, so there's a lot of variation of that in terms of like how inactive is that inactive period. But we'll talk about that when we get to animals. We got to save that discussion for another time. It's Sydney, right? Okay. Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, who knows? Yeah, that's a good question. So plants are interesting. I will answer your question to this. It's not as big of a risk as it is in animals. Let's say just in animals in general. And there are a lot of reasons for why that is. Many of them are too complex for us to talk about in this class. But it's still a problem. So you want to get as much cross-fertilization as you can, but it's not as big of a problem as it is in animals. Yeah. So here, some of your diversity of gymnosperms, actually just of conifers. And so conifers, most diverse of all of your gymnosperms, really well suited for really dry places. Okay? And we'll talk about this. Actually, we'll talk about it in the very next slide. So our third framing question. How would you distinguish between a cycad and a palm tree? And you're like, I don't even know what a cycad is. And so if I saw it and I was like, that's a palm tree, it must be a palm tree and not a cycad, because I don't know what a cycad is, right?
Yep.
I get it. Unless you actually look at a cycad and you're like, wow, that really does look a lot like a palm tree. I don't know what to do. Okay, so let's talk about gymnosperms versus angiosperms. So modern gymnosperms do not bear fruit. They don't make fruit, they don't make flowers, and they produce naked seeds. Okay, and so you're like, okay, well, if I can get the seed from this plant and I look at it, if it's got a coat around the seed, it must not be a gymnosperm, right? Because a coat is clothing, right? Naked means there's nothing on it. All right, I got to tell you this too. It doesn't have a lot to do with this. So we're in Michigan this summer. My family and I, we go to Michigan. I teach at this field station there, and we're doing this group project. There's a dude that he has spent his entire life studying the invertebrates and stream ecosystems. Really, really interesting. Okay, it's not. But it is for him, which is great. But so we're like collecting all these invertebrates out of the stream, and there are some of them that actually don't produce a coat, and some of them do. And so he was calling them, the ones that didn't produce a coat, he was calling them naked, and the ones that did, he was calling them clothed, right? And then so another like, very sarcastic faculty member walks up and he's like, hey, I've got a problem with this. I don't think they're naked. I think they're homeless. And then, no joke, the guy spent 30 minutes rebuking him on why he would call them homeless and not naked. And I have no idea like where we got during that discussion and like where I feel. But it reminded me of this when I said they produce naked seeds, because I guess you could call them homeless seeds as long as you weren't around this guy. Yeah, anyways, so if you're looking at a cycad and looking at a palm tree and you're like, wow, they look a lot alike, but if you looked at the seeds of the cycad, they wouldn't have a seed coat. Naked seeds, they don't produce flowers, they don't produce fruit. Okay, and then we can separate our gymnosperms into 4 living phyla. 1, Coniferaophyta. That's just fun to say. Coniferaophyta. There's a lot of f in that word. All right, so these are usually tall trees, needle-like or blade-like or scale-like leaves that are really good at reducing water loss. So it makes it to where conifers are really well adapted for arid environments and really well adapted for cold environments, because if they don't lose a lot of water, they're also not going to lose a lot of heat. And you might be thinking, like, why on earth does a plant need heat? Same reason we need heat. For chemical reactions to happen, you got to stay warm. Right? Y'all are in Gen Chem, or you're either in Gen Chem now or you were in Gen Chem at some point. When you want a reaction to stop, you stick your stuff in an ice bath, right? And the reaction will slow down and eventually come to a stop. Because when things get cold, reactions don't happen as quickly. Okay? So they're also really well adapted for cold weather because they can store their heat. So those are conifers. Then you've got Cycadophyta, or cycads. Okay, these are gymnosperms, meaning they don't produce fruit, they don't produce flowers, and their seeds are naked or homeless. So they have large compound leaves, and so they look like palm trees. Their leaves look like palm fronds. They are the dominant plant in the Mesozoic era. I don't know how that would help you tell them apart from a palm tree, but it's true. And then something that would actually help you tell it apart from a palm tree is the sexes are separate. So some individuals produce small male cones with male gametophytes inside. And what is the male gametophyte of a seed plant called? Pollen. Right? Male gametophyte of a seed plant is pollen. Okay, and so some individuals produce small cones that contain the pollen. Some individuals produce large cones that produce the female gametophytes. Okay, so cycads. Dominant plant in the Mesozoic era, thousands of species. I think there are only a couple of hundred of living species of cycads, which is sad. Ginkgophyta. These have fan-shaped leaves, and this entire phylum has one living species, Ginkgo biloba. Sexes are separate in this one as well. Both are pretty, they're pretty plants, but one of them smells really bad, and I don't remember which one it is. I think it's the male, because I think I remember when I read that thinking, ha, it's funny, the male stinks and the female doesn't. And I wouldn't think that that was as funny if it were the other way around, but it may actually be the other way around, because I actually probably would have thought it was funny if it was the other way around too. But anyway, sexes are separate in this, and Ginkgo biloba as well, harvested for mental health and a number of other things, has been harvested for a long time. And then the last phylum, Netophyta. And this group is believed to be the most derived because it is the most like angiosperms. Has broad leaves like angiosperms, wide, sometimes wider than they are long. Also has a lot of vessel elements inside of the xylem where you're carrying water and nutrients. And so you have a really complex vascular system. But these are all vascular plants, right? So you've got a vascular system. You've got those tracheids, right? You remember that? Your non-vascular plants, they don't have tracheids, right? You remember that? You should remember that. And you're like, we just took an exam last week, and you said seedless plants weren't on it, so I haven't even looked at it since then. I get it. I get it. But we have another exam coming up, and seedless plants are on it. So here's a CYCAD, and again, if you looked at this, they look a lot like palm trees. But then if you opened up that cone inside, you'd find that any seeds that were inside, if there were seeds inside, they would be naked, and you would know right there, not an angiosperm. Okay? Which if it's not an angiosperm, it can't be a palm tree, because palm tree is an angiosperm. And angiosperms make clothed seeds, or seeds with a home, however you want to deal with that. All right, we're out of time. Thank you for your focus, your hard work on a Monday. I appreciate it, the interaction.
Will the quiz for this week be on last week's material?
Yeah.
It'll just be this week's material?
Yep.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
And do you have time to look at my test?
Yeah. Today,